And one of his greatest pictures is this picture of eternity, the German telephone system, represented by this tiny kind of mannequin. It's a major picture in world photography history, I would say. He took, I don't know who he was, no idea. The idea that you could have a major photographer who just died and nobody knew who he was, it's astonishing. He did this picture, which is, I suppose, on writing. I write about it, I put something in the book on it. It's taken in late evening when the sun is at a certain direction and the sun picks out edges. He's writing, so you know that it's a general concept he's writing. And then what he does is to demonstrate in the fall of shadow, light, the cursive movements of writing on the edge of pieces of wood. It's a sort of reflection of small-scale human activity, again, in this sort of cosmic environment. They took up, in 1942, when this was probably taken, they took up, a lot of Germans went native. They were put into villages in certain parts of, a lot of Russia was depopulated, but they went into certain villages and they got to know local people. And some of them worked as almost as performance artists. This man did. The woman has been asked to stand slightly to one side to mimic the tree. And behind the tree is a military vehicle, which is camouflaged. And she's pointing. It might be, and it reminds me, it's Fra Angelica or somebody like that. It's an annunciation. It's something is in the background. It's a pure picture. And I think that some of them had probably looked at people like Carlo Carra, the metaphysical artists of the 1920s. And you were free in Russia to do exactly what you wanted. So you could do Carlo Carra pictures when nobody would know anything about it. The other thing about what I'm trying to say is that there was a kind of conflation, putting together of contemporary horror and the civilized world, civilization. This, for example, is a picture taken at a river crossing where Russians had been caught by superior German power and shot. And that's a Gatling gun with metal wheels, typical Russian piece of equipment. But it's been turned into something like an archaeological site. And it's important that it has been. He photographed 6 or 7 of these graves. They're trenches in which people had been killed and left. And they turned into something like archaeological exhibits. So it's a way of invoking archaeology as a study. It's something I pointed out previously. Other people, the clients I made the book for didn't, they were interested in Fokker-Wulf undercarriages and that sort of thing. But I could see that some photographers, they went with an idea of science and civic society and research, finding out, making things difficult, setting what the Germans called making Wechselbilder, puzzle pictures. There are a lot of puzzle pictures amongst them. You've got to work out what they are. And I found they were religious people too. I would say to Messerschmitt experts or Tiger Tank experts, that X and Y were very interesting. They couldn't see that they could be interesting at all. But this man, in his pictures, he invokes the Bible in some respect. I don't know which bits of it. Scenes around the Passion of Christ, burials, raising Lazarus, that sort of thing. They're lowering somebody into a pit. I could never understand what it was. in order to understand it, this again would take you back to Merleau-Ponty, I had to experiment with my hands and wonder whether it was his feet or his hands. I couldn't really tell, but it involved me physically, not just sort of in a scholarly way, but physically to see what he was doing. And I remembered various biblical events of this kind. He found people burying a woman, I think it was a woman or somebody, who'd been killed by neighbors. I think that what happened is that a lot of Communist Party officials, when liberated by the Germans, killed Communist Party officers. And he gives a heading, he says, someone killed by their own people. And I think Paul in the Bible talks about the killing of Christ by his own people. It's something, he's mimicking and remembering the Bible. Another burial of that kind with a beehive. It's a sort of timeless, what the English call a skep. It's a woven straw beehive. And I think that in the book, I said that this reminded me of, and was meant to remind me of, Virgil and Dante in Hell, painted by Delacroix in 1822. It was seen by photographic critics as an entirely ridiculous idea. But I think this too has that evocation of culture. It looks like that. And the Germans, they didn't get to Moscow, but they found a substitute for Moscow. I'm saying that the war was a sort of like a fantasy tour, a mystical tour. It had aspects of redemption about it. They found a sort of sacred city descended out of heaven. I don't know whether that's from John or Paul, I forget. It was a substitute for Moscow. Yes, one of the major photographers I found his name too. He was called Scholl, S-C-H-O-L-L, and that's him with a beard. He was a very handsome man and was ceaselessly photographed. He took photographs and was photographed. He was in a Bavarian Highland mountain regiment, they're Catholics, I think. And his way of getting over the catastrophe of war was to, in a sense, invent or present himself as an energy or a sympathetic energy which would overcome or would be equal to the distant horrors of the place. This sort of laughing, crying, shouting, joking continually. And he took a lot of pictures. His ambition, because what the Germans really wanted to be, German artists, they wanted to be cartoonists, they wanted to be drawers, because drawing was the way of expressing force and power, spirit. And he took pictures endlessly of people. They're very rare, these sort of pictures, of people who just were going into combat or were coming out of combat. When you came out of combat, you stared into the distance. You didn't talk to anybody, or you talked and you looked at maps and so on. And he took a lot of these pictures. His idea was that one day he would be a war artist, but his photographs were infinitely superior to any war art that I've seen. And this is one of his drawings. He hoped to be, because all German regiments had magazines, and soldiers contributed drawings to them, cartoons. And if you were very successful, you'd get a proper position. And one of his major pictures, which he'd carried in his pocket, you can see his sweat on it. It's like that you've seen the Dying Gaul, haven't you? That famous sculpture. It's a sort of vernacular, a found version of that. It's that mixture of the well-known, that's sort of steeped in culture. It's a German tanker, a Russian tanker who's escaped from a T-34, which has been burned to death. The other way of making normal photography, have I overdone my time? No. The other way of overcoming the war was to pretend that it was a sort of, it was a bureaucratic exercise, that it was quite a good thing, that you could talk to people and persuade them. And this is by a man called Konrad Vogel, who was a fairly high-ranking officer. And I found a picture of him with Gersdorf and one or two other people who tried to assassinate Hitler. But he was a well-meaning, good man. And his idea that the war, it could be saved by getting groups of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians together and talking to them about the bright future with parish councils, democratically elected mayors and that sort of thing. And this is at the very beginning of the war. He insisted on normality wherever he could find it, sometimes in extreme circumstances. There's a man on the left-hand side of the picture who appears to be patronizing a shop, a local shop perhaps, but with corpses lying around. So he took normality to extremes. Vogel. This is a brilliant and wonderful picture by him, where he explains it. This is Sergeant somebody or other writing home, and the child, who'd be a Russian child, going into the child has no fear. Normality has been restored. People could live in worlds of their own. Bear in mind, you're dealing with the 1920s and 30s, a sort of Freudian world where people are interested in saving themselves in a kind of secure way they could easily recognize. So he photographs a man an officer reading a paper and his aide-de-camp living in his own head. He was a sort of cultured, it's a benign view of things. This is somebody else, a more mysterious photographer I found with several pictures. He was probably killed. He'd taken up with a Russian woman, and maybe with help, he can't have taken the picture himself. He got somebody to lie like this and I can't understand what it's about, but she's coming out of the shadow. She's coming out of light into shadow. He liked to frame the sort of surge and activity of the war as well as he could. He liked to conjoin that idea of rough action and care, the German word for care, I forget what it is, Sorg, something like that. A vivacious sort of horse scene with a pieced together edge to the thing. He also, it's as if he'd looked at early Malevich and saw Russian houses as sort of Cubists' inventions. This very complicated picture with circles and ellipses put together. This is probably the war's greatest photograph. It was taken by an anonymous artist in Minsk. It was Belarus the Second World War was fought predominantly in Belarus and in Ukraine. And it represents an early phase where civilization and friendship would triumph, according to the well-meaning officers. And you've got a child playing, and this whole range of officers, of soldiers, imitating or presenting themselves as restless. They're perhaps bored by it, they want to leave. but their gestures we can recognize. They're the sort of gestures we do when we get brassed off or pissed off or bored or whatever. And it's a major, it had been put on by local people to satisfy them. He found theatrical sites, German officers playing chess with a sort of, yes, it's as if he was trying to recreate a more genteel world. You see that the man in the background is a butler. He's serving tea. And just above him, there's a stuffed owl. You can see that. He took several pictures of this. And he liked, whenever he saw get-togethers, soldiers, their accompanists, to frame them somehow. Again, to invoke the idea of culture and norms. Ah, yes, this is a good one. This is probably a radical German. And this is a quotation from Hitler. We must never forget that all things, the beginning of all things lie in acts, something of that sort. But what he came up with was this. This was taken in the Crimea in, I think, 1943. And it's an idea of the world going about its business, irrespective of the war, and Hitler's talk about energy and overcoming with force and power. A woman carrying something on her shoulders, and the pigs going about their business in a sort of untroubled way. The other thing that you find often in photography, it's one of the great war topics, is potato peeling. Potatoes with a staff, about the Germans ate a lot of potatoes in the Second World War. And potato peeling was the great sort of anti-war event. It was a social, low life, low grade, normal event. This man, for a lot of these. The other things that Germans liked were overturnings. They liked to show the world of official business overturned. They loved to show truck breakdowns, which had then to be pulled by either Russian prisoners or any Germans who happened to be in the area. There are a lot of pictures like this. The other great competitive sports event in the war was to show groups of 8, 10, 20 men pushing trucks out of mud, because it was a way of judging character. If 60 of you have, or 40 of you have to push a truck out of deep mud, there are people who do the most of the pushing at the front, and there are people who hang around the back. And so it was like a study of human nature. But this isn't one example of that. This is a sort of Jan Dibbett series about slow time, because the war was a frantic effort of killing and bombing. And this man, whoever he was, saw it in this, you remember Jan Dibbett, he used to take pictures of the moon rising, 1970s. This man photographed slow time. In the background, there was a column of horses, and the foreground, trucks, all of them bogged down. It was a way of estimating, of noticing this small time, because if you check the photographs, they move. For instance, the man with the spade moves to 2 or 3 spots. He can't do it. It's beyond him. There's a major German photographer, a primitive, a sort of Francis Bacon of the German army. I don't know what happened to him. He's called, forget his name even. And this picture he called "Ihm ist alles Schnuppe." I think it means it's all over with him. It's finished. A Schnuppe is a candle, the end of a candle. And he had this intense sympathy for everyman. It's everyman, but again, he's an interesting photographer. He wrote poetry, and he put all of his pictures into Russian exercise books. And he's a major artist, but the poetry is doggerel, poor quality poetry, but the photographs are sensational. It's a man at the end of his tether, but he's enthroned. It's a sort of mock enthronement. And again, it's this kind of dialectic that I find everywhere in these sensitive photographers. I think this is about the last one. Oh yes, they also, Immer am der Wand lang, I think it's called, it's a popular song. It's based on a popular song where somebody drunk has to get home by following the wall, by leaning on it. It's a popular German song of 1911, I think, and it's used as a title for this. People at the end of that tether, what to do, shoveling manure. And this is where it was fought, principally, where it's being fought today, probably, but with more digital equipment, I think. Okay, well, I hope I've given you some idea of what photographers made of the war, and they're innocent sort of people in the street. I don't think any of them, apart from Vogel, were significant. They were truck drivers, and they were old, quite a lot. They were in their 30s and 40s. They'd been they were conscripts, I think, but very few of their names are known. Most of them, I think, were killed. And I love to find their pictures put together by children in the 1950s and entered upside down. You get a major artist whose work had been assembled by grandchildren, put upside down, and not in any kind of order. But it was possible to redeem some of them. Okay, thank you very much.